Now that I've made way too big videos on both Phantasy Star and Xeno, I feel like that classifies me as a sci-fi RPG YouTuber. And you know what? Yeah, that checks out. Sci-fi is probably one of my favorite literary genres, and Blade Runner is my favorite movie. Now, I actually have a shred of self-respect, so you'll never see me make a video on, say, the Legend of Heroes games. However, there are plenty of other science fiction RPGs that I love. So today I'll be discussing one that I have kind of got a love-hate relationship for, Star Ocean. Despite there only being 6 games and one still playable spin-off, I can't help but be fascinated by the series. But that's enough talking around the bush, so I think it's time we get into the games proper. Back in 1995, Telenet Japan's Wolf team released Tales of Phantasia on the SNES under publishing by Namco. That game's development was an utter mess, and a lot of the developers were not happy with how the project ended up. Shortly thereafter, 3 of its members left the company and founded their own under the name of Triace. The original Star Ocean would be their very first game, having a lot of the same tone and very similar gameplay. We're not talking about this version. Whilst it does hold out very well, its PSP remake, First Departure, is basically superior in every way. Now, there was a remaster of that remake, but unfortunately, in my opinion, it's significantly worse. For the most part, they added a run button and upgraded the audio and visuals and added new art because frankly, the art from Production IG that was used in the PSP remake looks like dog shit. However, in exchange they messed up the balancing pretty badly. The original was extremely easy and could be beaten pretty quickly. First Departure R, on the other hand, overcompensates by making the game more difficult than it needs to be, in order to incentivize grinding and pad out runtime. Now, if that's fine with you, then by all means go play FDR, but for the sake of this video I'll be focusing on the SNES original and First Departure. Star Ocean is kind of weird about its sci-fi energy. Don't get me wrong, while it is most definitely a sci-fi series, large parts of each game are much more fantasy oriented, being set on underdeveloped planets resembling fantasy settings, with only parts towards the beginning and the second/third acts actually going into the sci-fi elements. In Star Ocean 1, they take until the story's climax to get actively relevant again, and whilst they become more and more relevant as the series went on, it still does often feel like the games are 60% fantasy and 40% sci-fi. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. Let's go through the big differences between the original and the remake. I already mentioned that the original is similar to Tales of Phantasia, however there are still quite a few quirks unique to Star Ocean. For one, the game doesn't take place from the side view, but from an angle, which doesn't sound like much, but it adds a third dimension to battles that the Tales games from that era don't have. You also don't actually move your character, instead you select the actions from the menu and the character then moves automatically to use whatever action you've selected. Be it either an item, or magic, your regular attack, or one of the specials that you can map to the shoulder buttons, one long range and one short range respectively. That's about all that is different in terms of gameplay from the original to First Departure, because FD itself actually takes its entire gameplay type from Star Ocean 2, the second story. You can now actually move and do all of your actions in real time, but this is also where the combat system's biggest flaw comes into play. You don't really have much in the way of defensive options outside of just running away from an attack and hoping that the attack doesn't reach you. In the early game that can be pretty irritating, however, it becomes much more manageable later on, thanks to the single most important mechanic in this game, talents and skills. After every battle, you get not only XP but skill points of 2 types. Every character can use those to learn a bunch of skills of those types. The first are related to combat and the second to exploration. Battle skills include a random chance to block or dodge incoming attacks, instantly teleport behind an enemy, or increased spellcasting speed. Field skills, on the other hand, function a bit differently. Each skill you get increases certain stats. The knife skill, for instance, increases your strength. On their own, that's all they do. However, depending on which field skills you've leveled up, the respective character can learn a certain talent, like being able to use materials to craft items or cook food, or the ability to increase or decrease enemy encounters. In theory, this sounds awesome, but it comes with a massive caveat that the game doesn't tell you about. See, every character possesses unique attributes, such as the passive ability Animal Instinct. In order to use certain talents properly, you need to make them be used by a character with a compatible attribute. For instance, the talent to decrease random encounters has the opposite effect of actually increasing the encounter rate when used by anyone who doesn't have the Animal Instinct trait. The game doesn't tell you this. You're supposed to just figure it out on your own somehow. This skill system is what makes or breaks these games for some people, because depending on little more than RNG, an encounter can go from being a complete dumpster fire to you steamrolling the enemies like they're nothing. There's no in between. Levels aren't remotely as important as proper skill distribution, and since there's no way to respec, there is a very real possibility of you screwing yourself over down the line. But that about sums it up in terms of combat. What makes these games really stand out is, ironically enough, related to the game's party building system. You see, this game doesn't just have a traditional traditional system where you get a bunch of characters and just pick whichever ones you wish to put in your party. Instead, you only get 4 mandatory party members in this game: Roddick, Millie, Ilya, and Ronix. There are 9 other characters which you can recruit, 2 of which being new additions to First Departure. However, you can only have a total of 8 party members, meaning you would need at least 3 playthroughs to have a party where you reach the ending with every character in your party at least once. In order to recruit them, you first have to meet them somewhere in the world, then follow through a side quest involving them before they finally join your party. Sounds simple enough, but some of the recruitment conditions are extremely asinine. Some characters are even reliant on what other characters you've already recruited or not, and others are extremely easy to miss. I'd be willing to bet most people don't even know Tunique is in the game to begin with. To get the best party member, for instance, you have to recruit 3 other characters first, and then go through an easily missable bonus dungeon, which on its own locks you out of getting half the other characters in the game. Granted, there are no bad party members per se, but it's pretty much impossible to recruit every character you want in your current run without a guide. Since by virtue of being optional, most of the characters don't have any large impact on the story, they instead get their relevance through private actions. You can enter every town in the game in PA mode, which means that the party will split up and go about their own business. You can then find them spread around and occasionally trigger scenes with them, which leads to stuff like learning new skills or starting questlines involving NPCs and whatnot. This also raises an invisible relationship meter between the characters, and depending on the party's relationships with one another, they all end up getting their own separate ending, which means there's a total of 80 endings. It's just a shame that the story and characters in this game are extremely uninteresting. They're not bad per se, just kinda there. The entire game is pretty underwhelming in how basic it is with a lot of its content. Ultimately, the original Star Ocean, and by extension its remake, is a conceptually really cool game, but also just somewhat of a nothing burger. It's not bad, but just not that special either. Eventually, Star Ocean ended up getting a manga adaptation by the name of Soshite Toki no Kanata, and honestly, it's pretty good. The art is nice, and it follows the story pretty faithfully, while also including every party member from the original release and their side stories. The translation I read for it was a little rough at times, but other than that, I can only recommend this one. It's a pretty enjoyable read. 2 years after the release of the original Star Ocean, Triace would release Star Ocean 2, the second story. This game was an upgrade to the original in practically every way. Everything I said about gameplay regarding First Departure applies here to both the PS1 original and Second Evolution, the PSP remaster, though Second Evo did add a playable character. It's honestly really impressive how well this game manages to one-up its predecessor in, like you said, every way. Whilst by no means my favorite Star Ocean, there is a damn good reason why SO2 is generally considered to be the best in the series. This time there's only 2 mandatory characters: Claude, the son of Ronix and Ilya from the first game, and Rena, a girl from this game's main setting, the planet Expel. You choose which of the 2 will be the game's protagonist at the start, and depending on your choice, there'll be some variations in scenes and a single party member exclusive to the respective route, though it's nothing major. Claude's exclusive scenes involve the Galactic Federation and ties back to the first game, whereas Rena's are more so focused on fleshing out Tour's world. Every other party member is entirely optional, and yet every single one of them is extremely memorable and a million times more fleshed out than any character in the first game. As I said earlier, the gameplay in both the original and Second Evolution is pretty much identical to the one at First Departure, so I won't get into that. However, the latest release in the series, and the entire reason I pushed this video back to the end of the year, is a full-on remake of the game titled Second Story R. This is the definitive version of the game to play, and easily the best Star Ocean game to date. The visual upgrade to the HD2D style is gorgeous, though I do wish they'd turned down the bloom a little and updated the PSP sprites. The new character art is really good, even though the mouth movements are a bit uncanny. But no, the real winner here is how they updated the gameplay. The biggest hurdle with recommending Star Ocean to people was that the gameplay unapologetically sucks. More in some games than others, but it is never actually fun as it could be. This game fixes that completely. For one, they added a dodge button. Timing your dodges right instantly brings you behind an enemy, allowing you to absolutely decimate them. This is something that is actually taken from one of the later games we'll be talking about. They even found a way to make your backup party members useful. You can assign them to the D-pad and set any one move for them to use when summoned. Once they're done, they'll disappear and you have to wait for their cooldown to wear off before you can summon them again. They also added another mechanic from later games: the bonus gauge. Basically, the better you do in battle, the higher it rises. Once it's full, you get a permanent bonus until the gauge breaks. This happens when the character you're playing as either gets staggered or dies. The bonus you get depends on what formation you've selected for your party, and can range anywhere from an attack boost to an increased item drop rate. They also made your basic attack not suck, meaning you aren't forced to rely on nothing but your specials anymore. These might not sound like much, but they really add up to make the game so much more fun. They also generally made exploring the world and dungeons much better. There are no more random encounters, and and they added a bunch of new talents to make progression just that much smoother. For instance, Bodyguard, which lets your non-controlled party members automatically kill any underleveled enemy you encounter on the field. Hell, you can even see each other's relationship status and check up on all of the 99 endings you've already gotten. The amount of playtime all of these small but significant quality of life improvements cut down on is insane. For comparison, here's my save file of Second Evolution during the approach of the final dungeon. It took me 27 hours to get there. Here is me at that same point in the game in Second Story R. Just 9 hours. This is undeniably the best ocean game ever made, and that is saying a lot. The original Second Story is a classic, and thanks to the remake I'm finally able to recommend it to people without having to add a massive "but" at the end of each sentence. Sure, there's still the occasional difficulty spike in an otherwise pretty easy game, but Second Story R gives you more than enough options to circumvent them pretty easily. If you're ever going to play a single Star Ocean game, then please make it this one, it's absolutely worth it. Remember how I said that Star Ocean 1 had a manga and it was pretty good? Well, 2 also had a manga, but this one's pretty rough. The art is solid and the story is adapted similarly to the first game, where every party member is included, but it comes with a big caveat. It was left unfinished, stopping before even reaching the game's second disc. Eventually, the manga itself ended up getting an anime by Studio Dean titled Star Ocean EX. And this one, it's damn bad. It's really not good. The animation is stiff, the story is dragged out to 26 episodes in an incredibly forced manner, and it generally feels like a very bloated version of the story. And wouldn't you know it, this one also wasn't finished. But not to worry, Star Ocean 2 manga and anime fans who for whatever reason still haven't given up and played the game already, because the story did end up being finished in the form of 5 drama CDs titled EX Navigation, which served as the conclusion to both EX and the manga. One has to respect the commitment to not leaving things unfinished, but somehow I feel like this wasn't the right way to do it. Almost a decade later, with the release of Second Evolution, SO2 did eventually see a finished manga serialization in the form of the Second Evolution manga. It sets out to do exactly what the original manga was supposed to, but actually follows up on it. The art in this one is really nice, though it does have the occasional oddity here and there. The most standout part about it is the fact that it covers Rena's route, as opposed to the Second Story manga and EX, which focus on Claude's. If you're going to go through any adaptation of SO2, then please make it this one. It's by far the best, and I'm not just saying this because it's the only one that actually got finished. After SO2, Triace decided to hold off on making the third main entry, and instead made a Game Boy Color spin-off named Blue Sphere. And I shit you not, this is the most ambitious game in the series to date. The game takes place some years after SO2 and features that game's entire cast of playable characters. You can at any point select 3 of the characters to put in your party, and all of them come with their own unique skills. See, world exploration has seen massive changes. For one, enemies are now on-field encounters, being the first game in the series to have those, and you can even attack them ahead of battle to get an advantage. But for everything else, you kind of have to imagine this game's exploration to be similar to that of a 2D Zelda game. You can swap between the characters in your party at will on the field, and all of them have their own unique skills that you can equip to the B button, be it botany, running, moving crates, jumping, and so on. They use this to introduce several different puzzles, and it's something no other game in the series ever attempts. Even the combat was changed quite a lot. Ironically, this game's combat is the closest to Tales of Fantasia, in that everything takes place on an entirely 2D plane. The basic attacks pretty much stayed the same, though specials are now bound to the directional inputs to accommodate for the Game Boy's lack of buttons. The big changes, however, come from the fact that instead of just attacking enemies, they now have individual body parts that you can eventually cripple, causing them to start limping or lose an attack or two. And each character has a unique finishing blow attack. In theory, all of this sounds great, but here's where the problems creep in. See, instead of getting XP, battles instead grant you just skill points, which you then use in a similar way to the older games, wherein you use them to boost your stats and learn new skills and whatnot. The issues arise once you realize that SP is shared across your entire party, and the enemies get stronger really quick. So you're basically forced to grind unless you want to deal with this game's funky ass and frankly stupid crafting minigame. The latter half of the game's dungeons can also get extremely confusing sometimes, and it really feels like they were just trying to make you give up and buy a guide. If not for the enemies becoming increasingly more bullshit than for the dungeons. It gets pretty draining and is ultimately not nearly as fun as I wish it would have been, because fundamentally the mechanics and ideas presented in this game are really cool, and I wish they'd expanded on them in later games, but as the silver lining, the OST is fucking fantastic and in my opinion one of the best in the series. The music in the series is always composed by Motoi Sakuraba. Most of you watching will probably know him for one of two things. He's the composer of most Tales games, and he was the composer for Dark Souls 1. Usually his music tends to sound really samey, but his work on Triace games, especially Star Ocean and Valkyrie Profile, is spectacular. And Blue Sphere, as well as its arranged soundtrack, might just be one of the best things he has ever composed. The limitations of the system force him to work in creative ways you don't usually see from him, and that to me is really cool. Man, if only there was a better version of this game. Well, actually there kind of is. See, Blue Sphere actually ended up getting a remake in 2009. It looks great, probably used the arranged music and updated combat and dungeons. Too bad it is now a piece of lost media. This is the second time now that I'm covering one of the series' potentially best titles, and it turns out to be a lost media mobile game. Blue Sphere 2 ended up getting a manga, and this one's just a sort of second stories. This is supposed to be a continuation of that manga, and since that one was cancelled before reaching this 2 of the game's story, the 2 party members introduced in SO2's second half were completely omitted here. Other than that, it is a mostly faithful adaptation, but wouldn't you know it, it too was left unfinished. Thankfully, this is the last time I will ever have to say this sentence in context of this series. Star Ocean 3 Till the End of Time is an incredibly weird game. I wouldn't call it the best in the series, not even close, but somehow or another, it is my favorite. This is a game that is completely unrelenting in how it forgoes any and all convention of an RPG. Visually, it's a mess. The textures and colors are so flat that they make the unrefined models stick out like a sore thumb, yet it runs in widescreen at 60 FPS. And you know, this kind of makes sense. Star Ocean has always been Triace's series to experiment with the system's hardware in order to make their next games as impressive as possible. Lessons learned from SO2 were implemented into Valkyrie Profile, ones from 3 into Valpro 2, ones from 4 into Resonance of Fate, and so on. Because of this, Star Ocean games always look pretty rough when compared to what they'd build upon its metaphorical foundation. But hell, even the gameplay is a complete curveball, both for people who played the older games and people who play other RPGs in general. Let's take MP for instance. You know, the thing that you use when you use spells. Well, if it reaches 0, your character fucking dies. Letting HP reach 0 will kill them too, but that's to be expected. Aside from attacks just being set to a distance, they also have to be set to 2 separate buttons, which now correspond to a light and a heavy version. The bonus meter makes its first appearance here, and there's also this thing called the rage meter, which even after 2 playthroughs, I'm still not sure how it works. They also basically removed the entire skill system, and now you just distribute points to level up specific stats, though crafting is still a thing. There's also only 3 optional characters which block you out of others, though one of them is borderline useless, so there's no reason to take them over the other 2. Everyone else you can freely recruit under certain conditions. I know the way I'm explaining this whole thing seems to be pretty all over the place, but that's kind of because the game doesn't really explain its mechanics very well at all, and I can understand why. I'm having trouble explaining them myself after all. By far the most standout thing about this game, however, is the plot. Not gonna go into it, but SO3 has the honor of being quite possibly one of the most divisive RPGs of all time. It starts off pretty simple, but at the beginning of the last third, they throw in a plot twist that's so completely balls to the walls that it actually caused dozens of people to hate it. And honestly, I can't respect that enough. This is the kind of game we get maybe like once a decade, where all of these elements that under all circumstances should not fit together somehow just do. And it results in an experience that can frustrate you a lot because of how spongy the enemies are, and because it's almost impossible to not trade damage. But simultaneously, this game is unforgettable. Now, let's say you just want to see free story without actually having to, you know, play the game. Well, the manga is just that. I don't think it's necessarily a good replacement for the game, as you're missing out on what is arguably one of Sakuraba's best soundtracks, but it's still a pretty solid read. Up until now, the series has been consistent for the most part, but Star Ocean 4 The Last Hope is the first game in the series I would call explicitly bad. The dungeons are a chore to get through, the story is a complete mess, and the gameplay. Oh boy, the gameplay. Losing your MP doesn't kill you anymore, thank fuck, but they do enough other things to make the game as unfun as possible. Firstly, SP is now exclusively used to upgrade your attack skills. Fair enough. But then there's the changes made to the combat itself. Remember how the bonus gauge used to work? Yeah, that shit's been completely reworked to be like 20 times worse. Say hello to the battle board. Instead of rising by just playing well, you have to fill it up piece by getting specific crystals, which you get by fulfilling certain conditions. These crystals do shit like give you an extra point of SP or gaining 10% more EXP. Sounds fine on paper, but the game basically demands you use this as much as you can, as enemies will quickly overpower you otherwise, with your only resort being to grind. development. A lot. And then there's the blindside mechanic. Remember how in the section for SO2R I mentioned a mechanic where a well-timed dodge could get you behind an enemy dealing only critical damage? Well, this is the game that introduced that. In Second Story R, they balance it quite nicely so that it's a major part of your moveset, but far from the only viable tool in your disposal. Last Hope meanwhile is like, yeah, either use this shit or you're not getting anything done because enemies here are spongy as fuck. It's like for every cool idea the game introduces, it's always attached to like 4 or 5 other things that make it significantly worse. So the gameplay sucks, which for the series is kind of on par for the course. The story sucks. Characters suck and the dungeons suck. However, what this game does do well is its world building. While other Star Ocean games do have you travel across like 2 or 3 planets, this game is all about exploring unknown parts of the galaxy, making it arguably the most sci-fi centric game in the series. The downtime set between traveling from one of the planets to another is also where all of the private actions have been moved to. This alone helps the game stand out quite a bit from both the rest of the series as well as other JRPGs entirely. It's just a damn shame that the rest of the game doesn't really hold up as much. It's at this point in the series that I kind of start getting the feeling that Triace doesn't really care about making Star Ocean games anymore. All of their other games around this time are full of cool ideas and passionate. They basically are forced to keep making more Star Ocean because it's the most recognizable series. And I don't think that's ever more apparent than with Whilst Star Ocean 4 was a flawed game with some redeeming qualities, 5 has pretty much none. It feels so completely different to anything else a company has ever made, and I mean that in the worst way possible. It resembles a modern Falcom game more than it does a Triace one. I hate the term, but the only way I can accurately describe this game is soulless. It feels like nobody who worked on it actually cared. Where 4 was the most sci-fi focused game in the series, in 5 the sci-fi elements may as well not exist, serving more as set dressing than anything else. The characters may as well not exist either, the overarching story is an absolute snorefest. The gameplay is the most boring it has ever been, and visually it tries to go for some kind of style, but it just falls flat on its face. I'd say more about it, but honestly, I just can't be bothered to. The developers clearly didn't care, so why should I? Truth be told, I couldn't even be bothered to finish this game on my replay. I just got so bored that I felt I'd seen enough partway in. I'd argue this is the worst game Triace has ever put out. Now, before we get to Star Ocean 6, I'd first like to talk about its 2 discontinued mobile games. I usually make it a point to not discuss things that are literally unplayable now in depth, so I won't go into Material Trader. However, Anamnesis is actually considered part of the main series, being set between SO5 and 6. I remember this game actually being pretty decent back in the day, though I didn't play much of it because my massive hate boner for gacha games prevented me from doing so. It does however have a Japanese offline version. Getting it installed was a pain in the ass, and honestly it's not worth it. It's essentially just a model viewer for the game's characters as well as a collection of every cutscene from the game's campaign. Yeah, you can't actually play the game. If you ask me, that kind of completely defeats the point of an offline version, but I digress. Anamnesis ended up getting a novelization too, which seems to have been pretty good. However, there also was a companion manga to the game's second chapter, i.e. it's not an adaptation but rather just expands on things from the game. From what I read, it's pretty solid, but basically completely pointless to anyone who hasn't actually played Anamnesis. And lastly, there is Star Ocean 6, the newest non-remake entry into the series, and I've gotta come clean here, I haven't played this game. I wanted to, but I was never able to find a PS4 copy of the game at a reasonable price, and the PC version may as well be unplayable. It has an insane amount of performance issues that have never, and realistically never will be, fixed. It's a damn shame too, as I hear this game, while nothing amazing, is a return to form for the series, and the best game since 3. Granted, that's not a high bar, but it's something. But alas, I am in no position to play it. There's actually a bunch of stuff like some novels and audio dramas and the like that I haven't covered in this video either, so maybe if I ever make a companion video covering SO6, I'll cover those as well. But until then, that's it for me regarding the series. I'm extremely glad that Second Story R was a commercial and critical success, and I really hope that it has revitalized interest in the series. I want Triace to return to being the powerhouse they once used to be. The Valkyrie Profile series, for instance, is one of my all-time favorites, and it's frankly a crime that Valkyrie Elysium had no involvement from them whatsoever. But until then, I suppose all I can do is wait and see. With that said, I thank all of you for watching, and do me a favor here, have a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night.